Good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to this lecture by Professor Neil Robinson. And many thanks to the CPS for inviting me to moderate this interesting event. This lecture focuses on a very intriguing topic, that is the Russian-Ukrainian war and the changing forms of Russian populism. Before starting, let me introduce you Professor Robinson, although I think most of you know him from his research on comparative politics and Russia. So Neil Robinson is a professor of comparative politics at the University of Limerick, and prior to that, he has also taught at the Universities of York and Essex. His research focuses on Russian and post-communist politics, and particularly on the political economy of post-communism and post-communist state building. He's widely published and cited. He's the author, editor, or co-author of several books and papers in peer-reviewed journals on Russia and comparative politics, including the review of international political economy and Russian politics. I would like to mention some of them because there are so many, starting from the most recently published book with Rory Costello, titled Comparative European Politics, Distinctive Democracies, Common Challenges, that was published by Oxford University Press in 2020. His most recent work also includes an article titled Putin and the Incompleteness of Putinism, published also in 2020, and an article also co-authored with Milner titled Populism and Political Development in Hybrid Regimes, Russia and the Development of Official Populism. That article was published in the International Political Science Review in 2017. He's also the author, among others, of Contemporary Russian Politics and Russia, A State of Uncertainty, published by Routledge in 2002. He's also co-editor of The Political Economy of Russia, along with Roman and Littlefield, and of the Sage Handbook of Comparative Politics, which was published in 2009 and is co-authored with Todd Landman. And after this brief, compared to his work, introduction, I invite Professor Robinson to deliver his lecture. So, Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Just let me share my screen again so that the presentation comes up. So, yes, I am going to be talking about Russia and populism. It is somewhat contested the extent to which there is a form of official populism in Russia. There are people who are strong proponents of Russia having developed a form of official populism sometime in this century. Different people give different dates, and then there are people who want to see populism as something which really only exists in opposition to the Putin regime. So for some people, sort of Putin isn't a populist. The populists are his opponents, both from the left and from the right. People in particular like Alexei Navalny, who sort of complain about official corruption and condemn Russia's elites for leading it down a wrong historical path. I, sort of am, sort of in the tribe, I suppose, that argued that there was a form of populism developed under Putin, roughly, for me, after about 2012, and that, sort of populism was the sort of framing sort of discourse for Russian politics for at least a decade. However, I'm beginning to wonder whether or not Russia still has a form of populism, whether the sort of the populist elements of Putinism in the 2010s perhaps have been replaced by something else, and that kind of what that is and where it's going remain to be seen. So I'll make the case really, I suppose, for seeing sort of Putinism as a form of populism and official populism in the start of this lecture, and then we'll move on to discuss some of the things that might have developed since. For some people, you know, sort of even to talk about Russia and Putin as populism is a form of conceptual stretching. That, you know, sort of the term is being drawn to cover too many cases, and therefore, you know, sort of its ability to tell us anything specific about a political system begins to decline. You know, sort of the classic Sartorian balance between intensivity and extensivity. I'm aware of that danger and cognizant of that, you know, sort of as a problem. However, I would argue that, you know, sort of the qualifier official is what is important here. You know, sort of we're not, when Sarah and I wrote that article, about 2017, it was never our intention to sort of say that this was a form of populism comparable to what we might see in social movements in Latin America or political parties in Europe, or, you know, sort of in terms of the ways in which, you know, sort of populism has been organized in other parts of the world. But to say, you know, sort of there is a rough family resemblance between the ideas and discourse and concerns that were articulated from roughly 2012 onwards in Russia with, you know, sort of populist forms. And that this, you know, sort of was a way of framing, thinking about, for Russians or for Putin, thinking about what Russian democracy was and how it operated and why Russia was still a democracy, even though, you know, sort of it was, you know, and as it was departing more and more from liberal democratic forms. So, you know, sort of what is Russian populism? So, you know, sort of populist components have always been identified in Putin's politics. You know, sort of there were themes in the sort of first two presidential terms of Putin between 2000 and 2008. That, you know, sort of were claimed by some people, Philip Kasula probably most notably, as being sort of populist and as, you know, sort of acting as, you know, sort of signifiers that Putin and the people around him were trying to articulate in order to sort of cluster together, you know, sort of support within Russian society as a way of legitimating Putin's government and perpetuating that government into the future. Now, I think those elements were clearly there, but, you know, sort of populism's development during this early period was severely constrained. First of all, it was severely constrained by the fact that Putin didn't associate himself with some of these terms. So the idea of sovereign democracy, for example, was something that was associated with a man called Vladislav Surkov. And Vladislav Surkov, although he worked in the presidential administration, was never a, you know, sort of as important as some people made him out to be, and he never managed to get Putin to use the term. And there were counter arguments about, sort of Russia and its history and its place in particular within Europe that were articulated during this period, which meant that, sort of these populist ideas and sort of and signifiers were never really kind of, sort of fully developed into something that we could argue was populism. It was only after 2011, 2012 and the electoral cycle that followed the global financial crisis, which was particularly severe in Russia, that, sort of you began to see these things as being stitched together. So what we have is, sort of what we call populism in power or official populism. So populism, sort of taking a kind of basic Laclauian definition is, sort of something where floating signifiers facilitate the mobilization of popular demands which are not, sort of incorporated, recognized, serviced through the sort of normal politico-administrative system. And this form of mobilization generates this, sort of social energy, these, sort of particular forms of politics, which, sort of challenge the system, which are anti-elitist, which frequently sort of, sort of have performative elements centered around a key leader. All of those things, sort of exist in official populism, but they exist in a particular way. And the way that they exist and come about is that they are not, sort of necessarily about mobilization, in the sense that, sort of it's talked about for political parties and political movements, but they are about how the relationship exists between in and out groups in the process of state formation. So it is a way of describing state-society relationships rather than some form of mobilization. And this, sort of is what lifts the sort of the ideas that, sort of were sort of floating around in the 2000s into something, sort of greater than the sum of their parts during this period. So it's not, sort of just a simple legitimation strategy, right? So, sort of, there are lots of people and lots of politicians who, of course, use various kinds of populist tropes in their speeches, in their addresses to people, right? Sort of, in fact, sort of, there probably isn't a politician in the globe who does not do this, because, sort of, kind of all politicians make appeals to, sort of something larger than, sort of a particular constituency. They talk about, the nation, the people, the need for some form of rejuvenation of the political system to service people better. But, sort of only when it becomes something larger than that, as in a way of describing what the relationship between state and society should be, with, sort of society framed as the people, that you begin to move into the realms of official populism. So this is, sort of different to, sort of Putin's popularity, right? So, sort of there were some people who, sort of described Putin as populist in the 2000s because he had high approval ratings, high levels of popularity, right? But that, sort of is not a way of defining populism. It is simply, sort of, kind of a recognition of, sort of one politician's standing. So, sort of what we needed to do and what needed to happen in Russian politics was to sort of go through this process of connecting up different strands of, sort of the people into something that, could constitute a populist frame for analysing Russian politics from within Russian politics, right? So, sort of it had to be there. It wasn't something that, sort of we as outside analysts were creating in order to sort of make a claim. It had to be something that was, sort of physically present within the political system and articulated at the highest levels, right? So this comes about after, sort of 2012. So it was not simply a fact of, sort of subsuming elite groups. That's something that happened during the 2000s to create a political party and to create an electoral system which was heavily managed and in which, sort of there was no effective opposition. It was not the ways in which there were coalitions of economic liberals and security forces, Siloviki, strongmen, that, sort of took place again in the 2000s and had occurred earlier. So it's not about elite coalitions. It is about, sort of how you develop this particular state-society relationship and a particular state project, sort of in which the people are given a specific role, right? So the weakness, if you like, of Putinism during the 2000s was that there was no concept really of the people, except as, something that had not, sort of gained from the post-communist transition. But the people had no character, if you like. There was nothing that was associated with them. Rather, sort of, there was just, sort of people who had done badly by the people and therefore who needed to be opposed. Oligarchs would be an obvious example from Putin's period in office between 2000 and 2008, when, sort of these extremely rich, sort of bankers with industrial interests were disciplined first through, sort of the control over media that they managed in 2000 and later then when they were sort of even more forcefully told to stay out of politics through the Yukos affair and the arrest and imprisonment of Mikhail Khodorkovsky. So, sort of, it's only when, sort of the economic model that, sort of that existed in the 2000s ran into trouble, that you begin to see this shift. So, sort of the hope had really been that, sort of on the back of building a kind of soft authoritarian system between 2000 and 2008, Russia was going to be able to launch economic modernization. This was the sort of the agenda that was handed over by Putin to Dmitry Medvedev. So I used to know somebody called Vadim Medvedev, so I always say Vadim Medvedev rather than Dmitry Medvedev. It's kind of a tick that I've not been able to train myself out of, even over the course of, sort of 15 odd years. Sort of this was what was handed over, but, sort of it ran into the global financial crisis and failed, and so you had a sort of an identity crisis in the Russian political system between 2008 and 2011. And at the same time, sort of that this was happening, you did begin to see, sort of an attempt by parts of the opposition to draw together some notion of the people as, sort of opposed to the Russian political elite. So, you know, sort of, as I said, Alexei Navalny is the kind of the poster boy for this. His anti-corruption foundation, his, you know, sort of websites, his videos, you know, sort of all of these things, you know, it's been argued, have presented, you know, sort of Russians with an alternative to Putin, based around, you know, sort of an alternative personalized form of leadership that, you know, sort of simply creates a sort of binary opposition between, you know, sort of elite and people, corrupt and pure, that, you know, sort of fits in with the idea of populism as something that is ideologically thin. Now, I think that might be stretching it a little bit too much. I think there's actually a lot more to Alexei Navalny than that image of, you know, sort of him as being opposed to the regime and opposed to a corrupted elite. You know, sort of, I think, you know, sort of he has tried to do more than that. And, you know, sort of to say, you know, kind of he is merely what was presented to Russians through social media, through Facebook, through Vkontakte, etc. You know, sort of as you know, sort of these series of videos with nothing else there, and rather simplifying what it was, you know, sort of Navalny was trying to do and what he represented. But, you know, sort of it was part and parcel of a challenge. And that challenge took multiple forms, you know, sort of around this time, some of which were clearly sort of, you know, sort of populist style activities. So the Blue Buckets, for example, which was a protest movement whereby drivers, in particular in Moscow, stuck a blue bucket on top of their car, right? And the blue bucket looked like the police, you call it beacon lamp, on the top of a car that certain cars had that allowed them to drive down, you know, sort of reserved lanes for officials and escape the traffic, which, you know, sort of, if any of you have been to Moscow will know is absolutely appalling. Right, so there were these, you know, sort of movements, these diverse, you know, sort of you know, kind of groups like the Blue Buckets, like the Strategy 31 movement, that, you know, sort of were drawing together different kinds of political interest and social interest that had been widely ignored by the system and had, you know, sort of generated anger. And this came out in the demonstrations against electoral fraud in 2011 and 2012, where there was, as Ilya Matveyev pointed out, a notion of, you know, sort of the people as a kind of living constitutional force that could go to the streets and could represent itself through protest in opposition to the Putin system. So some sort of response needed to be made to this. And the response that was made, you know, sort of was this civilizational discourse that Putin put forward that, you know, sort of recreated the idea of what the people were in a way that, you know, sort of brought them supposedly into alignment with the state, gave the state a function that was, you know, sort of something that it could manage, and this created this form of official populism. So what Putin argued, a series of newspaper articles around the time of the 2012 election, and then subsequently in a whole bunch of speeches over the course of 2012, 2013, 2014 in particular, was this idea of Russia being a civilization and having a civilizational identity that is essentially conservative, religious, and sort of morally different to the forms of politics offered by the West and offered by his opponents. So this identity Putin claimed was organic. It was something that had been generated in the centuries of Russian development from sort of the Kievan Rus onwards, and that Russia was a multi-faith society and a multi-ethnic society, but the relationship between these people of different faith and these people of different ethnicities was essentially a peaceful one because they shared common religious and conservative values. So there's no conflict between people. These conflicts had, he argued, been worked out over a long period of time to create a specifically multi-ethnic identity as a part of a unique civilizational space. So, sort of Muslims, Orthodox Christians, Jews, Buddhists, it didn't matter what your sort of faith was, you shared a similar set of conservative moral values, and these all sort of coalesced together to create this Russian civilizational identity. So you could be a Russian, as in the sense of being a citizen of the Russian Federation, of being Rossiyski, without being ethnically Russian, and Orthodox without being Ruski. So this, sorry, this sort of identity, Putin argued, as the foundation of the state. The people and the state are not divided in any way, shape, or form. They constitute each other, and the survival of the people guarantees the state's nature and characteristics, and the activities, the functions of the state are primarily concerned with reproducing the people. Russians with an O, Rossiyski rather than Russians with a U, are a state-bearing people, Putin claimed. Now, this is an idea that goes back into sort of various branches of at least 19th century Russian thought, where, sort of there is a distinction drawn between, people who can bear a state and people who can't, small groups who don't have the sort of the civilizational weight to be a state-bearing people. But for Putin, this was not, sort of a question of ethnicity, as it was for some sort of 19th century Russian thinkers. But this was something that was within everybody within the boundaries of Russia as a historical entity. So not Russia the country, but sort of what is sometimes called the Ruski Mir, the Russian world. All of the people who had participated in this 1,000-year-long process of state civilization formation. So Putin, sort of argued that this was something that had been preserved in Russia in a way that, sort of had not been done elsewhere. So, sort of other states, as it says there in a speech in 2013, had, sort of revised their moral values and ethical norms, eroded their traditions and the differences between peoples and cultures. In other words, they had, sort of become part of the homogenizing world, and therefore had accepted the equality of good and evil, and that this, sort of was essentially anti-democratic. It was not based on, sort of people's organic, historic given interests, but elites instead had, sort of pushed ideas which were abstract and alien to people, and thereby broken people down. So societies where this had happened, and he was particularly talking about Europe, Western Europe in particular, people where this had happened had, sort of lost their connection with the political system. Right, and the movements which were correct political movements were the movements which we might more conventionally identify with forms of right populism in, sort of France and Germany, etc. So these, sort of movements were attempting to reconnect, to reassert the sort of core values which were historically part and parcel of people. And, some societies were, sort of very much in danger of this. This is obviously a Ukrainian facing the future that on the one hand has God, religion, family, and sort of the historic glories of the past, the defense of the motherland, the three bogatyr, and sort of space exploration with Yuri Gagarin, or on the other hand, the European Union, homosexuality, drug abuse, and devils, right? So, sort of Satanism. And those are the choices, right? So Russia, sort of is a true democracy because its political system represents the people as a whole. It is not a liberal democracy, it is a popular democracy, sort of in which people are not divided through political parties into sort of segments of, sort of by sexual orientation, by economic stratum, etc., etc., etc. So Russia is truly democratic. And, sort of this needs to be defended, right? Because he argued, sort of the dangers to this relationship between state and people, and therefore the danger to both, the danger to breaking down the state by breaking its organic connection to the people, and the danger to the people by weakening the state that could therefore no longer be able to contain and represent their true, pure interests because of globalization, cultural homogenization, right? So, sort of there we have, the avatar of globalization, Starbucks, overwatched by a big portrait of Marshall Zhukov, right? So, sort of which of these two ways are you going to go? Now this, sort of reframed, sort of what was legitimate political agency, right? And, sort of, for me, populism is always something that, sort of makes specific claims about what is legitimate political agency. And for Putin, what was illegitimate were the people who articulated abstract ideas, liberals, with ideas about tolerance. Tolerance is sort of a no-no in Putin's Russia. Multiculturalism, which divides people rather than seeking out the common moral basis that they use to guide themselves and organize their lives through, traditional family units. Sort of the left, obviously, with ideas about revolution and transformation, and ethno-nationalists, right? So, sort of, kind of put the accusation has always obviously been that Putin is a nationalist, whereas really what he is a statist for whom the state represents a nation which is multi-ethnic rather than, some sort of traditional kind of ethno-nationalist. It's a bizarre form of civic nationalism, if you like. So Russia was in more danger, Putin argued, than at any time in its history. Ironically, even the dangers of the Soviet system, which, sort of was based on abstract ideas imported from the West, Marxisms, sort of were nothing in comparison to the dangers that existed in the contemporary world, because there had been some sort of correction in the Soviet system back to, traditional moral values from the sort of late 1920s, early 1930s onwards. And there had at least been the continued unity of the people who had made up the civilizational space of Russia in the sort of the Soviet system, whereas these people were now split away from Russia into Belarus, into Ukraine, into the independent states of Central Asia, etc., etc., etc. So, sort of Putin, very clearly with these ideas cast certain people out, right? Sort of established a logic of political equivalence between his opponents, between, in particular, the sort of nationalists and liberals, right? In a fashion that was anti-pluralist, and sort of speaks to that element of the populist tradition, and you can sort of see it here. This was on the front of Moscow's main bookshop in 2012, and it says the fifth column: aliens are amongst us, right? And the aliens there, the most famous ones are Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny, and the aliens there are, the others are sort of cultural figures of pop stars, and the aliens there are straight out of the Ridley Scott movie Aliens. And they're amongst us. The fifth column is here: their agency must be denied. So, this, was also kind of in some ways an anti-institutional discourse. Leader and the state as an idea were placed above other organizations and institutions, not just parties, but also the sort of the sectional interests that might exist within the state itself, right? And this was the only way in which Putin argued you could guarantee the renewal of the Russian political system over time, right? So the state project was concerned with sort of protecting this relationship of people through the maintenance of sovereignty, right? So, it wasn't about the satisfaction of people's interests within the political system. They were sort of left on their own in that sense, but the protection of their larger interests, which were just sort of defined discursively, that was what was important. Now, this was sort of slightly problematic for several reasons. The first reason is that, the regime's performance legitimacy became declarative, right, rather than substantive. It wasn't about securing economic growth. It was about, asserting that the correct relationship between people and state were being reproduced. Now, it was easy for Putin to do that. Right, because he has the bully pulpit of the leadership, and he can simply do it. But it also meant that the political system was in some ways rudderless, right? Bits of the political system could be captured by political entrepreneurs to foist their ideas about how to protect traditional values and to preserve and strengthen the purity of the people. Rewriting history books, introducing laws about education to, ban discussion of homosexuality or alternative lifestyles, sort of these kinds of actions, sort of were there, but, sort of there's no actual project for, say, economic development. Sort of these things are less important in Putin's world at this point in time than the sort of declarative performance of the state-society, state-people relationship. So that was always, sort of a trap. That, sort of the worldview that, sort of is being articulated, and the way of seeing politics and understanding politics that's being put forward, sort of only addresses a part of what are people's actual interests and their daily lives, which is to be paid, to make sure that, sort of your family is free from want, to make sure that, sort of perhaps you're getting wealthier, that, sort of the roads don't have potholes in them, the schools are open, the healthcare system works, etc., etc., etc. Those things, sort of move in a way beyond Putin. They're not part of his politics any longer. They're things that are the responsibility of other people. The second trap really was that, sort of this view of the world was something that Putin could only control in a certain space, that is in Russia itself, right? But its validity, sort of could be challenged externally. Right? Because if other parts of the Russian world, if other parts of what Putin argued, sort of shared this organic, sort of set of interests with the people of the Russian Federation, if they went off, if the Ukrainian chose the route of Europe, Satanism, homosexuality, drugs, and all-night partying, then, sort of, there were other ways of being part of the Russian world that were not allowed for in the Russian Federation itself. So you have this sort of anti-pluralist sort of discourse about the sort of that simplifies society and that says that this is a natural state of being, but sort of other people may not share it and may describe themselves as being part of your world, but with different views. So you have an anti sort of pluralist discourse that cannot control its environment. And that, sort of leads to, sort of a permanent sort of existential threat, in particular from Ukraine. So the way of dealing this is, sort of to try and, sort of limit their sovereignty and to argue that, sort of these other states need to be, sort of part of the greater Russia world, that, sort of their sovereignty is limited by the fact that their people have these underlying interests that are represented in Russia. And Putin sort of, expresses this idea on several occasions with regard to Kazakhstan, for example, in 2014 at a sort of summer school at a place called Selaga, and, sort of in comments that he makes about Ukraine during the Euromaidan crisis and the ouster of President Yanukovych in 2014, and as part of the Russian response towards, sort of Ukraine's overthrow of its government, with the seizure of Crimea, with the launch of the sort of separatist movements in Donetsk and Luhansk. So, sort of, you are a prisoner of, sort of other people's actions. Sort of, if you define yourself in such a way that, sort of means that other people deny your identity, you can in effect only clash with them, and you have to begin to sort of question the reasons why they're doing that. And for Putin, that becomes, the non-existent Ukrainian state has been taken over by sectional interests, the rich, and by fascists, by Nazis, who want to break the historic union that's existed, also we claimed, between Russians and Ukrainians, and an unbroken chain from the Kievan Rus right the way through to the present day. Right, so Ukraine becomes this problem. Right, the attack on Ukraine is, in the end, something which is almost necessary. Because this idea about, of civilization comes to dominate Russian foreign policy discourse, as well as domestic political discourse. Politics, international relations is all about relations between civilizational poles, right? And security is defined in terms of protecting your civilizational space and extending its claims to people who belong within it. Right, so you can see this in, if you go and look at a journal like Russia and Global Affairs, this is the idea that begins to become dominant in Russian foreign policy thinking in the wake of Crimea and 2017, 2018, which is increasingly kind of being used to frame what the proper poles of relationship should be. And to diminish the idea of Europe as a political space with interests of its own, right? The world is civilizational spaces, and they are Russia, China, India, the United States, and Europe is this kind of liminal zone in which Russia should have more of a say in the East, and the rest can go off and be part of the North Atlantic world with the United States if it so wishes. But for Russia to protect itself, it has to have interests above and beyond the sovereignty of the states that exist there. Ukraine is a natural focus of this, and a necessary focus of this, because it is the area where the civilizational space is most deeply in crisis, right? So the nature of the world view works its way through and defines the Ukraine as something that cannot be negotiated with, right? It can only accept political solutions which effectively give Russia a veto over its geopolitics and its geoeconomic integration with the world economy. And if Ukraine does not accept those, which it didn't, had a difference about how those, how Russia's interests were going to be, taken care of, then there can be no peace, and this is the only means by which Russia can guarantee its civilization, thereby guarantee the nature of its populist democracy against the incursions that are being made by globalist institutions, NATO, the European Union, and globalist elites who control those institutions. So where does this take us? Well, these ideas were sort of out there, but they were, not, sort of connected to a political project in the sense of there being action around them. It was, as I say, this declarative, sort of form of politics, a performance, rather than something that was, actually, shaping how, sort of the political system did things and to what ends. And the war obviously changes that. To some extent, that it heightens ideas about what is ours, and who is a part of our people come civilization come state, right? And it attaches sort of symbols and mobilization to those things in a way that hadn't been there before, right? That were very, poorly or loosely defined, and that sort of rose and fell because, the performance was more important than the construction of new identities around it. But this, in a way, is problematic, because the space for taking action around these things has broadened, right? So on the one hand, we have this continued identification of for Putin, for Russia, for ours. The top picture there is, ironically, Latin script Z, not the Russian Z, for Russia, for Putin, for ours, right? No one left behind. We do not throw our own away. We take care of ourselves, and we, are united in this. And Putin becomes a much more of an ideologist. Becomes a much more active articulator of these things. But, how far does he control this, discourse? How far, does he, act as an arbiter between different articulators of this discourse? Clearly he did, in the period before the war. If you particularly take the period from 2014 to 2021, Putin stood above discourse, shaping it, but, not being himself, if you like, owned by it, not subject to the the structural force that the discourse had in the ways that ideological regimes frequently are captured by the ways in which they talk about themselves. Now, he is, and that leaves open the question of how far you are moving towards a much more ideologized system, and for some people that, might mean that you're moving towards some form of fascism, right? Now, one definition of fascism, Roger Griffiths' famous definition, is that fascism is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism, right? So populism is in there, palingenetic means, concerned with rebirth, and ultranationalism, the people reborn through movement for the cause of nationalism. Yeah, but how far does Putin control that form of ultranationalism? And arguably he doesn't. It does also, of course, exacerbate the problems of performative legitimacy because, you not only have, sort of economic legitimacy, you also have, sort of legitimacy through military performance. And that, sort of creates further spaces into which other people can act, right? So, sort of the war has quite clearly opened up spaces for other political actors. And we've seen this, sort of in the last couple of weeks with Prigozhin and the Wagner rebellion, right? What we had was a conflict over effectively military contracts, and whether Wagner would be an independent political force from the Ministry of Defense, for which, its leader was paid vast amounts of money, way in excess of what was spent on the Russian military itself, comparable size units. And that, was the source of the problem. But the form that that problem took was, criticisms of the leadership of the military. Criticisms coming from Prigozhin of the military high command, of corruption, of betrayal, of, incompetence, that were not targeted at Putin himself, but which, were targeted at the key institutions of the Russian state. And this, escaped from official channels of media communication. It goes through things like Telegram, it goes through other forms of social communication that are mobilizing constituencies of nationalists, of people who are occasionally given equivalence with Putin. Right, you can see there that middle picture, Putin, Prigozhin, and Kadyrov, the leader of Chechnya, the three faces of Russian power. Now, how this has got a long way to go, right? Prigozhin, his popularity went up during the demonstrations. You can see there, opinion poll. I don't know if my, during the 22nd and 23rd of June, the number of people who approved in blue of Prigozhin went up to 50%. But they came back down again when the coup failed, well, it wasn't a coup, when the march on Moscow ended, and even though people liked elements of Prigozhin, saw him as being a straight talker, saw him as being a strong leader, a plurality disliked him because of his attempt they saw of trying to seize power, and the knife in the back, the words that Putin used and that people repeated to pollsters, betraying the people, betraying the state, betraying Putin, betraying the army, the ability to mobilize on these is so far relatively small. But it does pose a problem for Putin, and the style of his leadership has always been to incorporate. That in some ways was why you got the form of official populism that you got, because it was incorporating certain elements out of Russian historical thinking, but also elements out of opposition forces against Putin, that we're talking about, sort of the need for state and people to become one again. And so does he sort of incorporate more nationalism in order to deal with this problem? As yet, sort of we don't know. So I think I've talked for long enough. Unfortunately, I didn't really see what time. I didn't make a note of what time was starting, so I was a bit uncertain about how long I'd been going on for. But sort of there was this shift. Sort of there was a form of populism that sort of lodged and secured the nature of Russia's hybrid polity and its illiberalism, and gave it a form and gave people a place within the political system which was very particular and sort of based on a distinction between them and alien elites, the alien elites being sort of Russians who had different opinions about sort of ethnicity, different opinions about the organization of politics, but sort of it was sort of a clear sort of break with the politics of the past, to something that was much more systemized, but not, sort of concerned with day-to-day political activity, which drifted on. So it was, sort of official populism was, sort of, if you like, a form of veneer, but, sort of quite an effective one in terms of how it denied opposition agency. It was, however, in the longer term, sort of still too shallow to effectively deal with, sort of people's needs and interests, sort of because it couldn't conceive of what they were, right? Sort of it was not populism formed out of socioeconomic interests, even in the same way that certain forms of right populism are in the West, where sort of anti-globalization discourses and sort of ideas of economic nativism, kind of are much more linked to sort of preferences by economic organization than they were in Russia. And the war in Ukraine has merely heightened those tensions and raised the issues of how you manage this system in the longer term, because it has, sort of begun at least for the moment to create a sort of plurality of competing populisms that sort of Putin at the present point in time doesn't really show any great sign of understanding. Doesn't see how sort of some of these things can be instrumentalized as Prigozhin instrumentalized them in order to sort of change the nature of elite competition, and if he doesn't understand that, sort of then, sort of there are dangers of recurrence of these issues in the future, which may be more damaging than the events of the last week have so far proved to be. Okay, I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Professor Robinson, for this interesting lecture. I think that now we have 20 minutes for students to go into discussion rooms and choose one or two questions with the speaker of behalf of the group. Am I right? Okay.
Yes, thank you so much. Your lecture was especially important as we have a case competition about culture in Russia.